So welcome everybody. My name is Aoife Larkin and I'm the Learning and Conservation Manager for the Portico Library. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce the event Ground Cover Cultivating Ideas of Australia, which will be presented by Dr. Amanda Claremont. But first, I'm just going to run through some information which some of you may be familiar with, but others maybe not. So the Portico Library is a 19th century independent research library. Various forms of access and membership are available, but the library is also open to visit. It's open during the week and anyone passing through Manchester is always very welcome. We hold exhibitions and events throughout the year and they always respond to our collections. And inspired by the fact that the library holds a first edition of Cook's Travels, we're currently hosting an exhibition called What It Is to Be Here. And it looks at colonization and resistance to it in what is now called Australia. The exhibition can be viewed in the library, but it's also on the website. So we encourage you to explore that if you haven't already. And then there are just a few things about how the event will run this evening. The event is being recorded, so it will be available and can be shared by attendees afterwards on request. After Amanda's presentation, which will last about 20 to 30 minutes, we'll open up for questions and discussion. This event has been set up as an open meeting, so when we do the questions and discussion, you can either put up your hand and ask your question, or you can actually type them into the chat box and then I'll read them aloud for Amanda to answer. During the event, I'm sure you've already done so, but just to make sure that your microphones are muted during the presentation, just so that we get the best connection possible. Finally, that leads me to introduce the person that you're really here to hear from. And we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Amanda Claremont, who is a Fellow of the Royal Geographical Society and a graduate of universities in Manchester, London, and Melbourne. Amanda uses history, geography, and literature to think about the landscapes we make and move through, and tonight speaks to us about how colonial domestication of supposedly unsettled land in Australia covers multiple traces, revealing that colonizers see the land but cannot read the country. So thank you for bearing with me, and I hope you enjoy the talk. I'll pass on to Amanda.
Thank you, Aoife. It's my pleasure to talk to you this evening. And I would like to first thank Helen Idol, who's on the call, and it's the exhibition, What It Is to Be Here, has been curated by Helen, and I'm really honoured to be asked to respond to it. I'd also like to thank Aoife Larkin and James Moss of the Portico Library, who've been so kind and welcoming to me when I visited recently, and Aoife for her support right now and throughout. So as this presentation is about Australia, I'd just like to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of Australia. I lived and studied in Melbourne, so I acknowledge Koori presence across Victoria, particularly the Wurundjeri people of the Yarra Valley. You may know that Indigenous people in Australia have never ceded their country, not to Captain Cook, nor to anybody else. I can also acknowledge my own connection to Manchester. Like Helen, I also have a grandparent who was born in Manchester. My mother was brought up in Manchester before being evacuated to Devon during the war. And after the war, my grandparents returned and lived in a Wally Range until the mid-60s. When I came up as a teenager to an interview at Manchester University, I literally got off the train at Piccadilly, looked around, had a sniff and thought, I'll be okay here. This is fine. And it was, and it is. It was in Manchester that I developed a curiosity about Australia, although I was actually studying German. And ultimately, sometime later, I went to Australia to study it. I thought I'd be working on Australian literature, but in fact, my project became one of cultural and historical geography. I focused on domesticated plants, mainly apples, and what their planting and production said about being in place in Australia, what it meant to be Australian. And so that's how I approach this exhibition. Now, one of the, oops, Aoife mentioned Captain Cook. Now, let me see, I've got to work this out. And this year, it's 250 years since the then Lieutenant James Cook sailed into a harbour that he subsequently named Botany Bay. You can see on the screen a copy at the front page of Cook's instructions from the Admiralty, and the word up in the top left is secret. Cook had sailed on, having carried out an astronomic and observed the transit of Venus, that's right. And he had these instructions that he was to sail on to what some people call the Great Southern Land. And there we go. These, hang on, I've got to get used to this myself. This says towards the bottom, the instructions remark that he was carefully to observe the nature of the soil and the products thereof, and to bring home specimens of mines and minerals and stones, specimens of the seeds of the trees, fruits and grains that you may be able to collect. And he certainly did that. He was also to take possession with the consent of the natives. If you see just this bottom, the lower paragraph, to take possession of convenient situations in the country, or if you find the country uninhabited, take possession for His Majesty by setting up proper marks and inscriptions. Now, Cook admits later on, it's very clear, in August, they were in, they sailed into Botany Bay at the I think on the 30th of April. And by August, they were further up the north, in what we now call Queensland. And you can see, again, this bottom paragraph, we saw a great number of smokes, a certain sign that the adjacent lands and islands are inhabited. Now, we know that the country was not uninhabited, and that's significant. That this book here is a record of some of the things that were taken away from Australia at the time. So there's Cook mentioned, and the man in the middle, Joseph Banks, is absolutely critical to all of this. Banks sailed with Cook. He was a wealthy man, and he paid the Admiralty to be allowed to travel on this particular voyage. He took with him a couple of botanical artists, one of whom is the Sydney Parkinson, referred to here. And he also had other botanists with him. And what begins with the botanizing that leads Cook to name Botany Bay is the taking of plants and objects from Australia. And that's the start of the colonization to which the exhibition refers. We know what Banks collected, partly because of this book here, the Florilegium. All of these specimens are held in the herbarium at the Natural History Museum in London. And this list making or collecting, cataloguing is a significant colonial endeavour. people documented and recorded what they found and used the vocabulary that they had. So, for example, Australia is often described as a park because these are terms used in landscape studies at the time. It was the picturesque. So their vocabulary is very limited in this for what they see. And the plant on the cover, pictured here on the cover, is a plant that was subsequently named Banksia. So Banks is critical not only because he took the plants away, but he also he specified to the Admiralty when they were sending out the first fleet in 1788, or 1787, of course, what plants should be introduced into Australia. So what I'm really talking about, what's important, is this extraction, the taking away and the introduction of things that are not from Australia, that are non-native plants. This is what, if you were to look up Banksia now, this is what the kind of information you'd find. It is a native plant, and here is on the left. It's known as Wallum. That's its indigenous name, and many of the most of the plants that are listed in the Florilegium would now be recorded by their indigenous names. What's interesting, if you can just see on the red on the eastern side of the Australian coast there, that area corresponds almost quite closely to the area that was covered by Cook's voyage in the Endeavour in 1770. Europeans, of course, domesticated the land they found, but what Banks and others couldn't see was that Aboriginal people had done that for thousands of years, as explained in this book here and in others, but this is a reissued book from the published in 2015 from it's been updated and revised. It's great. It tells you gives you an extraordinary amount of information. Bruce Pascoe's work is highly significant. He points out, and he wrote in The Guardian earlier this year, there's nothing new about the fact that Aboriginal people had cultivated Australia. It's just what's extraordinary is that was ignored. He said, we turned our back on anything of Aboriginal provenance. Such was our sensitivity to the history of the country. So I'm going to move to talk about what it is to take the part of the exhibition at the Portico that is labelled What It Is to Take. One of the items in the exhibition was to have been the wood samples that you can see in this picture here. And these samples are held in Manchester Museum. I don't know their provenance, but the fact that they're there and labelled tells us about the dominance of Manchester as a global trade centre. Wood, of course, used for shipbuilding, then railways, housing, furniture. Wood was always needed. In the exhibition, Helen's included a book at the Portico called Timber and Timber Trees, Native and Foreign, written by a man called Thomas Laslett. Laslett was born in Chatham and became a timber inspector for the Royal Navy, for the Admiralty. And his book, published by Macmillan in 1875, describes his finding, what he thinks about wood that could be used around the world. And so he visits America and New Zealand and India, as well as Australia. And it's noticeable that his language in describing American woods is quite different, rather more positive. You know, he talks about how perfectly straight the wood is and how dense and wonderful it all is. Whereas with Australian trees, he's a bit more circumspect. So, for example, he talks about tuart, which is at the front of this picture. Let's see, the very yellowy wood, and says that has straight growth and noble dimensions, and he recommends it for shipbuilding, but not too much. Jarrah, which is up just above the tuart there, and it's a wood which is much admired even today in Australia. Eucalyptus marginata, these are all eucalypts. He's more equivocal and reports that although it was recommended for shipping, Lloyd's agent in Fremantle, Western Australia, was not impressed. Carey, which is over to the left, he says it's much to be regretted that a tree so noble in its dimension should prove so disappointing in its character, which he suggests that Jarrah has similar problems. The eucalyptus that's known as ironbark is as strong as its name suggests, but not strong enough because it's not very solid about the center. And he carries on and concludes, in a way rather regretfully, that all the specimens tried proved deficient in strength and tenacity. And this is, he seems entirely disappointed, which is rather sad. And this sets up an idea of Australia as not being good enough, or rather imperfect, which of course it was where we sent imperfect people, convicts and what have you. So these Australian woods sent, I don't know why these samples were sent to Manchester or were taken from Australia to be sent to Manchester. Maybe someone on the call might know that. But I think they're rather lovely. It's just lovely to see them. Unfortunately, of course, because of COVID restrictions, they couldn't be included in the exhibition. You can't pick them up. There's now, in the 20th century, the Western Australian government was much more positive about the tuart, which was the first one that I referred to. And I've put this in principally because I love the picture down here. And tuart is the indigenous name for this tree. And I really hope that all West Australian government inspectors wore jolly hats like this chap down here. But it's a fine looking tree. Now, I'm going to move from talking about trees that were taken out of Australia and wood taken out of Australia, after I've mentioned this one. There was a very clear use for this particular tree, as you can read. The eastern goldfields of Western Australia would very unlikely to have been developed if the mines hadn't been supported by this tree here, the salmon gum. So clearly there were useful purposes to which local wood could be put. And all of this is a kind of economic botany. It's all about extracting material for an economic use. If we start thinking about trees that were introduced into the colony, and this is an Australian orchard, although it could be Kent, we have to look at other types of gardening manuals. There's, in the mid-19th century, you can read about how fabulous Australian fruit could be, or Australia could be, if only it could be made more productive. And this gentleman here, James Sinclair, really believes that you have to introduce deciduous trees. This is not a description, an accurate description. It's just Sinclair envisaging how Australia might look, and it's wonderfully ridiculous. You know, make sure you've got a mansion, of course, because you've got to have fruit trees in masses around it, and in masses of apple trees resembling Great Britain, and some chestnut trees resembling Italy, and then a mass of olives to resemble Greece, with trees in relative positions to resemble its island, the islands of Greece. So this is the effect of writing like this is almost a visual cultivation, and this kind of very, well, you could call it scopic, this very kind of top-down panoptic view of what the colony should look like infects, but it also infects many colonial accounts. And even though this gentleman thinks Australia could be wonderful if it had all this wonderful fruit in it, this section, you can see I've put at the top, Subduing the Wilderness. He writes this in a section called How to Subdue the Wilderness. Now, these lovely fruit trees, whether they're in the shape of Britain or Italy, this is not a cozy, settled pastoral scene. He's writing it like this because he's trying to counter the threat, or the perceived threat, of the unknown, the wilderness. And hence he's covering up the local landscape with reinscribing the map of Europe onto Australia to try and subdue the wilderness and people's anxiety that he feels. So a little later, there's another gentleman comes along, also writing about fruit. And this extract is from a 2-volume catalogue of fruit that's available in the colony, not yet a state, of Victoria. Now, Claessen's a significant man in Victorian horticulture at the time, but this is his opening paragraph of a 2-volume book called The Fruit Garden. Has anyone thought seriously of the extraordinary condition in which the early settlers found the continent of Australia? No fruit-yielding tree worthy of perpetuation, not a single animal available for domestication, etc., etc. He's utterly astonished that the indigenous people had not taken advantage of the continent in the manner expected by Europeans, except of course we know that they did, but we only know that now. People, the advantage of work by people like Bruce Pascoe is that he's read the explorers' accounts closely, and they describe what they see. They just don't value it in a useful way. So another thing that's happening in texts like this and Sinclair's, whether it's wonderful excess like Sinclair or outrage like Claessen here, is that you can do down that Australia's being denigrated in order to then build it up. So if you say somewhere as infertile and unproductive, you can render it productive by doing things to it. And what they're doing is planting fruit trees. But one of the curious things that happens is that the apples and pears, and here's one which you might recognize, are not Australian fruits, not at this point, not until the very end of the 19th century. The outraged Mr. Claessen gives indigenous fruits, not Australian fruits, At that point, he names them indigenous fruits, just less than 2 pages out of 2 volumes on introduced fruits. So these are technically exotic fruits in Australia. Can you hear me? Wait a minute. No. Wait a minute. Do I need to unmute? No. Can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, all right. It sort of gave me a message that I couldn't be heard. Oh, sorry. So, Granny Smiths. Indigenous fruits, Australian fruits. Are Australian fruits indigenous or not? Well, this is the, Clarkson says in 1889, there's few fruits indigenous to Australia worthy of mention, and lists them as a meagre catalogue. And it's that word catalogue that is extraordinary. These gentlemen write exhaustive catalogues of fruit, and it's all part of containing and controlling the landscape they're trying to live in. And it's a way of allaying anxiety. Although Australia can be seen as hugely bountiful, and they write it up and they want to big it up and say how great it is, and you can have everything from plums to peaches to grapes to mangoes to kumquats, everything will grow here. This is not a natural history of Australia. It's an unnatural history of cultivation in Australia, because it's not a natural history of any part of the Australian continent. Early settlers feared of Australia because the land was unfamiliar, wild, uncontrolled, with the added menace of unknown, wild and uncontrollable people and animals. And so one of the things with having all these catalogues, these lists of nice things you can introduce, this helps to allay people's fears and get people to go to Australia and plant useful things like fruit. Now, one of the curious things is by the very end of the 19th century, other similar works start talking about Australian fruits and mean Australian grown fruits. So quickly, indigenous fruit gets completely erased, and as does the indigenous record. And the Granny Smith is believed to be an Australian apple, that it's a sport that grew from, but of course, apples aren't Australian. They're not native to England either, or to France, or to any of the places that believe that apples come from there. They're native, it's thought, to Kazakhstan, to Almaty. So however attractive these Granny Smiths may look, and those were on an Australian tree. I did take that picture in Australia. They're not, in one sense, they're Australian, but in another, they absolutely aren't. The Pink Lady, you can buy Australian apples now. The Pink Lady is an apple that came from Western Australia and is grown and sold and circulated throughout. And this was envisaged. People recognized this was going to happen in the 1890s because the apple thrived to perfection and was available all over the world. And indeed, Australian fruit was sent all over the world from, as you can see, from Tasmania and from all the Australian states except possibly the Northern Territory. And part of this becomes possible because of very changes in technology, and the Australian fruit takes its place on a world stage. But what's curious about this is that the apples aren't from Australia, they're being re-extracted. This is a tree that's been introduced to Australia, it's exotic, and then its fruit is re-extracted. And this is absolutely what happens in colonization. And the introduction and exchange of plant material is a botanical event which has had and continues to have profound ecological and social consequences. So the presence of apples in Australia is a direct consequence of settlement by Europeans. And without the introduction of fruit and vegetables, the first colony wouldn't have survived. Indeed, they nearly starved. But it's Sir Joseph Banks who puts fruit on the list of what should go out to Australia with the first fleet, and not just apples, but plums and pears and grapes. Of course, we know all about grapes and Australia and what happened to them, and we're still drinking them. And peaches. A French visitor to Australia in 1802 remarks on how the peaches had grown out of control, that the local pigs were nice and fat and happy because they were just eating all the windfalls of the peach trees. So that's all great, but the first settlers, although they gathered Australian native plants, they didn't know how to use them and what to do with them. And then because the use of those plants was unknown, native plants end up being colonized, same word, by exotic plant species. So those peaches grew out of control and took over from the native grasses and trees that would have been there. The process of planting production is never questioned in any of this work. So I want to suggest that this is a curious and uniquely colonial inversion. Introduced or exotic plants, in this case fruit trees, brought in by the settlers or settler invaders, as Indigenous people understand them, to whom the use and cultivation of those plants is entirely naturalized. They're used to apples, they know what to do with them. Australian plants, although native and indigenous, are exotic and unfamiliar to the settler or invaders, and as a consequence are absent both from the type, all the material I've mentioned, from the kind of catalogues. And I referred to all this in trying to show how material is extracted. It is taken, as Helen has shown in the exhibition, what it is to take, and continues to be taken. It's always being redone. I just want to close by referring to another element of the exhibition that if you've been able to have a look online or visit the Portico. There's a film in the section of the exhibition marked "What It Is to Speak." And in a very powerful moment in that film, the speaker wraps herself in a blanket, a pale blanket that covers her. Blankets woven from wool that may have been milled and carded not far from Manchester. To this day, sheets and towels and household linens are sold as Manchester in Australian stores. It's very curious. And perhaps that's a reference to the mills established around Manchester and why Manchester was such a powerful city in the 19th century. Wool, of course, comes from animals that were introduced to the Australian continent. Animals domesticated by other people in other places, sheep and other hooved and animals, horses, cattle, camels even, all introduced into Australia, as were plants. We know from accounts of early settlements that some of which are held by the Portico Library, that local indigenous plants were overlooked, not perceived as useful. But that was then. Now, thanks to the work of people like Bruce Pascoe, Bill Gamage and others, including Germaine Greer, whose book White Beach is about restoring her own land, and increasing research and analysis of early accounts by European settlers, including the careful study of pictures and drawings, now we can start to try to read the country we call Australia, to read the country, to listen to Indigenous voices and learn from what they say. The exhibition, What It Is to Be Here, at the Portico Library shows how we might do that. I'm going to stop. Thank you.
I think that's where there's a huge round of applause that we can't actually hear. But it's really nice to see people clapping. Thank you.
Oh, there's some perfect apples. They're Australian too.
So if you want to unshare your screen, Amanda, and then we'll try and facilitate some kind of Q&A. Now I can see everyone.
Never mind. Okay. Oh, I see lots of kind people on the call.
I've had one question come through in the chat, which asks whether, Amanda, you could give some information on the agricultural, social and political significance of the pineapple.
Oh, the pineapple. Oh, agricultural, social significance of the pineapple. Oh, the pineapple. Oh, they were planted in Queensland. I know that they go into Queensland. They're not, I don't think those bromeliads, they're bromeliads. I don't think they're native, but they're certainly a tropical plant. They're grown in Britain in Tudor times. They're introduced, I think, from the Americas. So like apples going to Australia, they're another example of plants out of place, which is a common definition of a weed, a plant out of place. So that's, I don't know much more, but then there's the big pineapple. Oh gosh, it's somewhere in Queensland. There's these wonderful, there's several vast exhibits of large fruit in various Australian states, and there's the big pineapple in Queensland. I remember that. So some of Katrina might know where it is, but
I think
it's in Beerwah. Okay, thank you, Kate.
Is it Bundaberg? Not sure.
Yes, it's somewhere up there. I've seen it. It's somewhere. I have actually seen it. I've been driven past it.
Not to be eclipsed by the big banana.
Yeah, indeed. So, oh, thank you. Near Australia Zoo. Okay, good. Somebody's kindly putting that in. So, yeah. So I don't know a lot about Australia, about some pineapples. I'm afraid that's probably the sum total of extent of my knowledge.
Well, thank you for the answer. I have another one here saying that they'd love to hear Amanda comment on earliest Australian botanical gardens, or an early garden that you find exemplary or interesting.
Early Australian botanical gardens. I mean, I love botanical gardens generally, although they're curious beasts like other domesticated species. I don't know if the Sydney Botanic Gardens predates the Melbourne Botanic Gardens. The founder of the Melbourne Botanic Gardens is responsible for introducing all sorts of plants into Australia. He was quite fierce, Ferdinand Baron von Müller, and he used to go out for walks and just sort of sprinkle seed around him, and including blackberries. So I, having grown up on the south coast of England, would happily go out for walks in Victoria and want to pick the blackberries, whereas my friends I was with would prevent me from doing that because they would likely have been sprayed as noxious weeds. The botanic gardens, what happens when botanic gardens are established in Australia, and I was going to talk about the man who established the botanic gardens in Geelong, not far from Melbourne, because he, although he had many Aboriginal, he's called Daniel Bunce, he had Aboriginal friends, and he used to use the Indigenous names for plants, and he knew them, and he writes a dictionary of the languages of the people that he knows in Victoria in the mid-19th century. He plants a botanic garden with introduced plants. They're curious spaces because they're bounded botanic gardens. People put all sorts of exotic things in them, and they also have a conservation function, which would have been important both to settlers to conserve the seeds that they wanted to keep, to have from wherever they had come from home, or also to preserve material, Australian material. But that comes much later. The interest in Australian plants and native plants comes much, much later, not until the 20th century. People actually start planting with Australian native plants. And the native food industry is later still. That's kind of 1970s, 1980s. And so, not sure if I've answered that very well, but yeah.
Okay, we've got a couple more comments and questions here. Steve Roman has said that Manchester goods are so called in several former colonies. And there are 32 or so places called Manchester around the world.
Yes, there are. I've swum at one of them, Manchester by the Sea in Massachusetts. So I've swum there.
Yeah.
In the US. So yes, there's several Manchesters. I think there's one in Australia, actually. No, I think about it, but I don't know.
And we have another question here which says, plants out of place. Amanda, does the shift from naming the plants Indigenous to Australian coincide with federation and a sense of identity, do you think?
Yes, almost certainly. Yeah. That's Brian. The suburban lemon tree and its ubiquity in Australian gardens. I can see that question. Yes, that's when federations in 1901, and then if you were talking about Australian fruit, you would probably be referring to Australian grown fruit, not necessarily Indigenous fruit, as I was trying to make clear at the end. But yeah, there's this national identity is built upon the products of Australia, and they can be even better than the old colonial, the products from back home. But that's what's extraordinary, is all these things are being returned home. They're being sent back and they're even better, returned to the mother country. So that's just a circularity. So it was the Brian, citrus fruits. Oh, I can see a couple of queries about citrus fruits. Well, they also carry for potential. I'm sure it was Australia was seen as a shipping hub. Citrus, the suburban lemon tree. I think that's probably post-war, but I'm not sure. I would associate it with, but Australians on the call may know better than I. I would associate that with Greek migrants to Australia. certainly the street I used to live on, I could go down the street and go Greek, Italian, Italian, Greek, 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 Italian, depending on whether there was an olive tree or a lemon tree in the front garden. So, but that's just me and in Melbourne. Scurvy, now Cook's voyages, Cook didn't lose sailors to scurvy. He already knew about the value of ascorbic acid, and I happen to know from another context, some of you know I'm a volunteer guide at the Chelsea Physic Garden in London, which is one of the UK's oldest botanic gardens. And there's a tree there that is called Drimys winteri, and it refers to another well, I forgot what I was going to say. It refers to an earlier ship captain, so somebody like 2 centuries before Cook, so a man who sailed with Francis Drake to the Southern Americas, and the bark of this tree is a decoction of it is used to treat what we call colds and coughs, and Captain John Winter captained the only one of Drake's 6 ships to return to Britain, and he was who noticed that people in Tierra del Fuego didn't get sick in the way that some of his sailors did. So maybe Cook had learnt something through his marine connections about scurvy, but he's famous for not losing sailors to illness. So, are there indigenous citrus fruits? Yes, there are. Yes, they're listed. There's and they tend to be listed as native lemons and native, so they're not, but I think the citrus, it does occur in Australia. Yeah,
Can I ask a question?
Indeed. Of course.
I know so little about this, and it's been so interesting for me. But I suppose I'm just wondering what the status of indigenous fruits are now, and are they being exploited to the same degree that these invasive fruits are, and what's happening around that now?
I think Helen might know more about that than I do.
Well,
but when I was doing, I mean, it's a few years since I was doing my research. I wanted originally to write a whole chapter of my PhD on indigenous fruit, and at the time it was very hard to get information about its cultivation because it was commercially sensitive information. So I think in the, well, let's call the hospitality industries, in terms of the food industries, yes, native fruits are used, and of course they're used by indigenous people for all sorts of, for healing and for food. So, and that's, and I'm thinking of things like pondong and the bush tomato, and some of them are very familiar and some of them are rarer, are more rare, or we know less about them. Oh, Bart, hang on. Bart's put a complex question in. What could I say about the difference? The colonization of cultivation of the traveling of plant-based technology. Well, I'm not plant-based technology. What, Bart, can you ask me that question? I'm not quite sure what you mean by plant-based technology.
What I essentially mean is how plants really have traveled for thousands of years by meaning of or by logic of migration, really. I mean, either continentally or then later intercontinentally. And by that logic, we do indeed, as you have pointed out, have plants anywhere in the world that hadn't been there thousands of years ago. So there is, I think, some sort of global logic to that. And then, so how does that correspond with, your say logic or argument of the colonization of cultivation? Like how do we, base that argument in a bigger picture of, some sort of
moving plants around the world? What happens from the 18th and particularly the 19th century onwards is that the technologies are developed to ensure the safe transport of plant material around the world. So up until the mid 19th century, people were reliant on, folding seeds up into pieces of paper or sticking them down their boots. There's a wattle, an Australian acacia tree that grows in Wapping in London's Docklands that I'm almost certain came in on somebody's heel. That it could not have been planted there. It literally grows between, and that happens all the time, all over the world, that people just they pinch things. I reviewed a book years ago about the monkey puzzle tree, the Araucaria, one of the Araucarias, and it's an extraordinarily, you may know what it looks like, it's very jagged edges, and reputedly the seeds were pinched, it's from Chile, and were pinched from a dinner table, and that's how it made its way to the British Isles. So it's sometimes it's planned and sometimes it's not. And botanic gardens, or places like the Chelsea Physic Garden, indeed, they didn't know what they were going to get. They'd stick seeds into the ground and see what came up. And it's certainly in the 17th, it starts at the 17th, but in the 18th century, with the classification of plants that was drawn up by Linnaeus, but he didn't start it. And by drawing and documenting and keeping records and making catalogues of everything, then people can track and trace plants everywhere. Sorry. Sorry, people in Manchester. That's a terrible expression. But, yeah, so I'm not sure that's quite answered your question. I think there's an individual, there's the circulation of plants to serve essential needs, and then there's the circulation of plants to service an economy. To service a colony, indeed.
I mean, I suppose there is even a random element to it where, seeds are carried by the winds, say. I mean,
And animals, birds famously. Birds sometimes they're pollinators, but often their droppings will, have seeds in them. So, and other animals, indeed. So,
was Australian soil just compatible immediately with everything they wanted to grow, or
no?
Yeah, I have the impression that things sort of exploded in this amazing, like, fertile abundance, but that they must have struggled to find things that would work and things that,
No, and they did struggle, and obviously they struggled not least with working out the seasons were reversed, but one of the things that becomes clear quite quickly is that Australian soils, especially after the introduction of animals like sheep and cattle, who, as I said, they're not indigenous to the Australian continent either, or to Tasmania, is that Australian soils are quite thin, they're quite fine. If you know what you're doing, as many Indigenous people did and do, then they used particular techniques to manage the ground. But settler didn't know about that, or they observed it, but they didn't understand what was going on. And so, for example, with burning, settlers observed that Indigenous people would burn, but they didn't realise that they were very, very controlled burns, and so didn't follow the in the same way. So the practice, yeah. So there's some suggestion that. And some of the kind of the writing about Australia being disappointing is because Australia is compared to America, and North America is always perceived to be more fertile and more productive. If you read sort of material about people traveling west, and they're always claiming more land, and it's always more fertile and more productive, whereas that's not the case in Australian writing. Or certainly not of the early 19th century.
So does that mean it was preferable for them to surmount these incredible challenges to grow their own fruit? It was to try and learn from Indigenous people?
Yes, and I don't know about preferable. I'm not sure how that, some people did try and learn, but it still gets disparaged. It gets, put aside. It's very odd. You can see people saying, oh, well, I can see that there's this wonderful hut. And what they actually mean is a house, a dwelling place, but it just gets described in a very, they can't acknowledge that it might be an adequate dwelling place, or that there's, then even in the, like a century after first invasion, another botanical explorer, he said, don't cut down the native trees, because then because of all the things that grow back. I might have to find that, because he realizes that, but then he plants other plantations. He introduces pine plantations, and then they get cut down as well, and Indigenous timber gets cut down for all sorts of things. There's a lot of the time it's fencing, which is something unknown to Indigenous cultivation. You wouldn't border your land with a fence, because why would a plant or an animal respond to a fence? How would they know that they're supposed to stay one side of it? So, anyway.
Okay, I can't see any more questions coming in, so might be time to wind it up. Before I do completely, I wanted to just introduce Helen Idol, who's joined us for the talk and who has curated the exhibition, and specifically to ask Helen to speak about the next event that we will host on the 31st of October. Helen.
Thank you. And thank you, Amanda. Thank you for your...
Go to Manchester, everyone, and look at the exhibition online, because you'll learn so much more. I certainly did.
Thank you, and thank you for participating. And I have a different feeling about the apple now as a sort of motif of colonization, global colonization from, did you say Kazakhstan, all the way through to Tasmania, and how the movement of the transfer of bodies and plants as part of that big globalization and colonization and the capitalization of the world, I guess. So thank you for your talk. And thank you for everybody for coming and participating with your questions. So on the 31st of October, on Saturday at 10 a.m, we are going to be joined by Renee Kulicher. She is joining us from Alice Springs in Central Australia, and we are going to talk with her and hear from her about her work. She's made the piece of the photographic work with Rhett Hamilton, which is shown at the library, where she's in a blanket. And she's also made the performance about that. So Renee is an elder, and she is one of the traditional owners of Uluru. So we're very pleased that she's got the time to speak with us on that Saturday. So I urge you to book a ticket and get your coffee ready and have some questions, and come and meet Renee and hear what she has to say. We'll be working with a translator, and she'll be speaking in her language. So I look forward to seeing you then.
Yeah, look at you can see Renee in the film on the website, and yeah, that will be an amazing, and I'm sure a wonderful encounter, and I look forward to listening to it.
Yeah, we weren't sure we would be lucky enough to have Rini involved in an event, so we're absolutely delighted and so privileged that she will be able to join us.
Yeah, that's very special.
It's really special.
Across that all the technology works.
Yeah.
Yes,
absolutely.
The vehicle doesn't break down on the way in, or something.
You'll be fine.
Okay, well, thank you,
it's such an honor
for that contribution. Huge thank you to Amanda for that really fascinating talk.
Oh no, thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much to everyone in the audience who's contributed questions or made any contribution at all. It's massively appreciated. So yeah, thanks for spending your evening with us.
And
we'll see you again soon.
And big waves to everyone. Thank you.
Good night.
Okay, good night. Good evening. Bye.
Catch up with some of you very soon. Bye, people. People still there. Kept the call open. Helen, are you okay? Was that not too?
Wait till they finish. Wait till they've all gone.
Peace gone. Michael's still there.
I've had one.
Hi there, Amanda.
Hi, Michael. Oh, and Katrina. Katrina lived in WA.
Oh, it's nice.
So these are academic friends, Australian American. So
Australian wine, hopefully.
I hope so.
Fueled by fine.
Excellent. Yes, I haven't been brought my wine glass yet. It's gone off the call.
It was a nice Shiraz.
Ex Shiraz, obviously. Used to be known.
I'll get in touch with you, Amanda, by phone, so you can talk to you.
Sweet, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Aoife. Cheerio.
Thank you. Yes, I should. Yes, and likewise, you too. I will be in touch. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Aoife. Yeah, must see you.
Well done, Amanda. That was fantastic.
Oh, thanks, Aoife. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for being there and doing it.
Yeah, of course. It went really smoothly. Well done.
Okay.
Great.
All right.
We'll
Cheers.
talk to you soon.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks.
Bye.